Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
Welcome to the Bloomberg Daybreak Asia podcast. I'm Charlie Pellet. Doug Krisner is off this morning. Major news out of Japan over the weekend, with Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba announcing his intention to step down. More on that in a moment when we hear from Amy Catalinac, professor of politics at New York University. Plus, we'll get the first Asian trading session after Friday's bleak U.S. jobs report. And coming up, we'll hear from Candace Browning, head of global research at BofA Securities. But we begin in Tokyo. Japanese markets are facing the prospect of more instability as investors prepare for Prime Minister Ishiba's departure. For a closer look, we heard from Bloomberg EcoGov reporter Sakura Murakami. She spoke with Bloomberg's Shery and Avril on the Asia trade.
Sakura, and we were expecting the Prime Minister to resign given the increasing pressure, but it came a little bit earlier over the weekend. What set this in motion?
So ultimately, it comes down to the two bruising national election losses that Ishiba oversaw while he was prime minister. There was this growing momentum within the party to try and bring him down. There's no protocol within the Liberal Democratic Party to oust a sitting prime minister who's unwilling to go. So that's why they were going to hold this vote on whether to bring up and to hold an early leadership race, which would technically have been an ouster. Surveys over the weekend show that there was growing momentum, that it looked increasingly likely that the LDP was going to kind of hold a no-confidence motion against Ishiba. And then ultimately, he had a chat with former Prime Minister Suga and also Prime Minister hopeful Shinjiro Koizumi. And those two people are powerful, well-known figures within the LDP. They supported Ishiba, and without their support, Ishiba would not really last. So that's probably what triggered his resignation.
And you mentioned Koizumi, for example, as a prime minister hopeful. Who are the other contenders right now in the running?
So the two top contenders right now, we've heard Toshimitsu Motegi is planning to run, but the real focus will probably be on Sanae Takaichi, who is a protege of former Prime Minister Abe, and as I mentioned, Shinjiro Koizumi, who's the son of a maverick reformist former Prime Minister Junichiro Koizumi. The focus, especially on Takaichi, will be she's very much for fiscal stimulus, so that would probably impact markets. And also, would be the first female prime minister, whereas Shinjiro Koizumi, he's 44, young, fresh-faced, very media-savvy, has very broad public appeal. So they both have their weaknesses and their strengths. It'll be up to the LDP to decide who they want to see lead the party.
As we watch for who these contenders are going to be, what's the next step for the LDP? What are the signs to look out for in the coming weeks?
So, as I mentioned, Koizumi and Takaichi all have their respective strengths. They appeal to different demographics, especially Takaichi would appeal to kind of more a right-wing and conservative base. Koizumi has more of a broader appeal. So the next focus will be how the LDP holds its leadership race. And there's a shortened, abridged version that they can hold, and then there's like what's called the full spec version or like the full version. And depending on which they hold, the number of votes that are allocated to normal, regular, rank-and-file LDP members, normal people who pay their membership fees and support the LDP, the number of votes that they are allocated to them differs, and so if it's a full spec version, then Koizumi would probably have an edge because he has broader public appeal. Whereas if it's if less votes are allocated to those rank and file members, Takaichi would probably have more of an edge because she has more support within the party, within the LDP lawmakers.
Bloomberg Japan politics and economics reporter Sakura Murakami here joining us in Tokyo. Let's bring in Amy Catalinac, Associate Professor of Politics at New York University, where she focuses on Japanese politics as well. Great to have you with us. Of course, we've been focusing on the range of potential contenders for the premiership. But at the same time, when it comes to global investors, they'll be watching what the new prime minister will do in terms of fiscal spending, which will make such a big difference when it comes to Japanese government bonds and also global bonds. What are your expectations of what fiscal stimulus will look like with whoever becomes the next prime minister?
I think it's a little bit hard to say because we're likely to see quite a few contenders in the race. So last year there was an election, obviously, that elected Ishiba, and we saw 9 different contenders, and they all had sort of slightly different views on this. And I think at this time as well, we're likely to see a crowded field. I think it's hard to say, what type of candidate might emerge, but there are a couple of candidates. Takaichi Sanae is one of them, who probably would advocate for more fiscal stimulus and monetary easing. So I know that her stance is pretty clear on that, but some of the others, I think it's a little bit hard to say. Ishiba's decision to step down has literally only just happened, so I'm not sure. We don't have a clear picture yet of who's going to run.
Given that the ruling party lacks the majority in both houses, what does it mean in terms of needing the cooperation of opposition parties, which could mean more spending in the future? And just tell us about the state of the LDP right now.
Yeah, so the LDP has just suffered a really 2 bruising electoral losses. So it's been kicked out of its majority in the lower house last year, and also it's lost its majority in the upper house. So the LDP has to go through a period of trying to figure out what went wrong in these 2 elections. So they're going to be looking for a person who can kind of set the party on the right track and come up with reasons why the party lost some of its conservative supporters in the previous election. It was clear that it did so, and why it also failed to mobilise votes among so-called floating voters, people who are sort of non-partisan and don't have strong attachments. So the opposition, but as you said, Prime Minister Ishiba, who's now stepping down, one of his sort of signature achievements, I think, while he's been in office, was his astute management of relations with the opposition. So since October last year, the LDP has been in a minority in the lower house, and Prime Minister Ishiba was very good, in my opinion, at mobilising support among this party for this bill, that party for the budget, another party for the supplementary budget. So he did a very good job of managing relations with the opposition parties. And whoever the party selects now to replace him is probably going to have to draw on that expertise potentially, or maybe the party will try and choose someone with that expertise, because they don't have a majority. So the first thing the person has to do, by the way, is actually win the vote in the lower house to become Prime Minister. And so that in and of itself is going to require because the party doesn't have a majority, it's going to require some people from the opposition. So that was something Ishiba did quite well, and so the party will probably be thinking about that as they choose a potential contender for his replacement.
Professor, as we were hearing from our colleague Sakura earlier, we are also waiting to hear whether this leadership election is going to be a full spectrum one or under emergency rules. How might either way shape the outcome?
Yeah, so the full spec version is the one that we had last year, the one that elected Ishiba, and that's one in which the rank and file get to vote. And there's about 1 million LDP members right now, and they all cast their ballots. They all get sent ballots in the mail. They cast their ballots, and they're translated proportionally into the same number of votes that the LDP Diet members have. So that's the full spec version. The abridged version, the sort of the quicker version, can take place via a plenary session of people in both houses of the Diet who are LDP politicians. And in that instance, each LDP politician, there's 295 right now, they have 1 vote each. And the prefectural chapters, of which there are 47, so the party has 47 prefectural chapters around the country, they all get 3 votes each. And it's also a runoff. So the election rules do differ across the 2 full spec versus abridged versions. But as the former commentator said, the abridged version gives more weight to Diet members' votes. And so the full spec version, all the party members get to vote, and in the second, they don't have the same weight. And so that could lead to the full spec version does prioritise someone with a lot of broad support throughout the country. So I'm not sure exactly how. I don't think Prime Minister has announced which one is going to take place, but there are some slight differences there.
Speaking of support, regardless of who the contender is, what is your sense of how factions within the LDP might provide that sort of support, including Taro Aso's faction, for example?
Yeah, so the reason that we saw such a crowded field last year with 9 contenders, and we're likely to see sort of quite a few people this year, is that factions have really, they've been substantially weakened. So they've basically been dissolved last year in response to the slush fund scandal. So I see there are sort of 2 groups that remain, but I don't see them as having a lot of power actually in this vote. I think it's likely that people are going to vote according to who they think should become the party leader. However, if you are a faction leader, you have a sort of an incentive to sort of argue that you played a role in the election of this person because you want that person to help you and to help you please your faction members and pass policies that you want after the election. But I don't see factions as playing a big role in this election at all. There could be some, maybe in the runoff and the convincing people to change who they voted for if there is a runoff. In those scenarios, factions the 2 remaining groups might play a role, but in general, I think we're going to see a lot of contenders, and people will probably vote according to who they think can sort of take the party ahead and try to recoup some of its support that it's lost in these 2 previous elections.
Amy Catalinac, really good to have you with us, Associate Professor of Politics at New York University.
Welcome back to the Daybreak Asia podcast. Charlie Pellet in this morning for Doug Krisner. The yen fell in early Asia trading as Japanese markets braced for fresh volatility. This after Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba announced over the weekend that he is stepping down. Meantime, Asian stock benchmarks are set to track Wall Street lower after a weaker than expected U.S. jobs report on Friday. For more, we heard from Candace Browning, head of global research at BofA Securities, and she spoke with Bloomberg's Shery and Avril on the Asia trade.
Candace, maybe let's start there out of Japan, because we are seeing futures pointing to some upside. What is your sense of, from your Tokyo trip, in terms of corporate governance reforms, maybe fiscal stimulus expectations, a cheaper Japanese currency, how that might fuel further Japanese stock gains?
So thank you very much. So when I was in Japan last week talking to investors, I guess if I had to sum up the overall feeling, it would be sort of that quote from Oliver Twist when the young boy says, "Please, sir, may I have some more?" So basically, I think that equity investors in particular really like the deflation story in Japan, and they really like the corporate reform story. And that corporate reform story seems to be, if anything, accelerating rather than decelerating. Now, over the weekend, we did have the surprising news about Prime Minister Ishiba, resigning. And I think that, that does have some very strong implications depending on, of course, who takes his place. But I think overall, the equity market, as long as the corporate reform story stays in place and the deflation story stays in place, I think the equity market will be absolutely fine. I think there's some questions in the bond market as it relates to what will the new leaders' policies be, regarding fiscal spending and monetary policy as well. But to answer the question in a nutshell, overall, investors remain quite positive on Japan.
To quote another Dickens novel, Great Expectations, let's talk about AI. Where are you seeing opportunities in the Asia Pacific there?
Yes, I think there are enormous opportunities, the best of times and the worst of times, but I put more of the emphasis on the best of times. About $350 billion was spent on AI this year. We project that by 2030, that spending will rise to about $1.2 trillion per year. So if you add, the whole period together, you're looking at $3 to $5 trillion being spent on AI. And just over $1 trillion of that will be in Asia Pacific. Asia Pacific is very much the backbone of all of the components that go into developing AI, whether it's the AI foundries in Taiwan or the HBM in Korea. Asia Pacific is a very important component of this new AI infrastructure. So we're very positive on that, and that is actually one of the tracks that we're emphasizing at our conference here in Hong Kong.
How much of that boost in AI here across Asia will also be made up of China? Of course, we have seen the optimism over Alibaba's investments into this sector as well.
Yeah, so listen, I think that China, the innovation that's been coming out of China as it relates to AI has really been very positive over the last year or so. And I think that really has contributed to a bit of a turnaround in perception of the Chinese market. And as you know, it's been reflected in the very strong stock market performance in China as well. So China's a key component of this new AI infrastructure and backbone throughout Asia.
When it comes to monetary policy, given, of course, that we are seeing divergent paths, whether it's from the PBOC or here in the Bank of Japan and perhaps a delay of normalization, what sort of dynamics will you be on the watch out for in the next year, especially given also the political landscape is a little bit unstable at the moment?
Well, in the U.S., given the very weak jobs report that we had, we're now expecting actually 2 cuts, one in September and one in December. And then we think there won't be any cuts until June of next year. And it's kind of a complicated story that they're dealing with because the reality is that it would appear that the job market is definitely weakening, although the unemployment rate still remains historically low. And we don't really know, by the way, what happened in the jobs market. Is it a result of new immigration policies, which were sort of a supply cut, or was it that employers simply were demanding fewer new jobs? We don't really know that. It's a little bit murky. But on the other hand, what the Fed has to deal with is the fact that inflation remains stubbornly above their target and may, in fact, go even higher. So they're dealing with a very complicated situation. We do think that they're going to muddle through. We don't think that there will be a recession. And one of the reasons for that is consumer spending in the United States, even using our own internal Bank of America data. Consumer spending has remained resilient. And also, if you think about AI and what I talked about previously, you've got a lot of cap spending going on, whether it's AI or it's sort of made in America, bring manufacturing back to the U.S. And you've got the One Beautiful Bill, which is a stimulus. So, yes, there's some problems in the job market, but there's a lot of positives as well.
And the inflation outlook, I think, is still something that we should be focused on. Candace, thank you very much for your insights. Good to chat. Candace Browning is Global Research Head at BofA.
Thanks for listening to today's episode of the Bloomberg Daybreak Asia Edition podcast. Each weekday, we look at the stories shaping markets, finance, and geopolitics in the Asia Pacific. You can find us on Apple, Spotify, the Bloomberg Podcast YouTube channel, or anywhere else you listen. Join us again tomorrow for insight on the market moves from Hong Kong to Singapore and Australia. I'm Doug Krisner, and this is Bloomberg.